Okay, so one of the topics was finding the inverse of a function. Okay, let me give you just a brief overview of what an inverse function is. Okay, an inverse function is a function that completely undoes a different function, or its inverse. Okay? For real simple terms, do you remember maybe the old function box or the function machine where you plug a number in for x and see what you get for y? Okay? So like, let's say this function box, its job is to add 3 every time. Okay? So if you plug a 7 in, out comes a 10. If you plug a 20 in, out comes a 23. It just adds 3 every single time. Okay, that's its function. What would the function be that would undo that function box? A function box that subtracts 3, right? Okay, so y equals x plus 3 and y equals x minus 3, those are inverse functions because one of them is going to add 3 to it, the other one would subtract 3, so it's doing the exact inverse. It completely undoes what the original function did. Okay? That's what an inverse function is all about. It is a function that undoes the original function. Okay? So let's say here's my original function. F of x equals 3x squared plus 1. Okay? First of all, what type of function is that? Starts with a Q. Quadratic. Okay? Quadratic. How can you tell it's quadratic? Has an x squared in it. Okay? We did a whole chapter about quadratic functions. Anything with an x squared is quadratic. Okay? So it's a quadratic function. It's got an x squared in it. What would the graph of this look like? What's that shape called? Parabola. Okay? Good. Okay? Alright, so here's my original function. Let's plug a number into that function. 2 is pretty simple. Let's plug a 2 in for x. Go ahead, plug a 2 in for x. Tell me what you get for y. Just mentally is fine. Plug a 2 in for x. Tell me what you get for y. 13. 2 squared is 4. 4 times 3 is 12. 12 plus 1 is 13, right? So when I plug in a 2 for x, out comes a 13 for y. Okay? Remember that. Plug in 2 for x, out comes 13. If your job is to find the inverse function of this, you're going to be finding a function such that if you plug in a 13 for x, out comes a 2 for y. It completely undoes what this original function does. And it can't just work for 2 and 13, it's got to work for any number. Okay? If I plug in a 1 here, out comes a 4. Okay? So it's also got to be a function such that if I plug in a 4, out comes a 1. Okay? Basically the x's and the y's switch spots. Okay? Or they switch. So if I plug in a 2, out comes a 13. So I need a function that if I plug in a 13, out comes a 2. Or if I plug in a 4, out comes a 1. Because if I plug in a 1 for this, out comes a 4. Do you see what I'm talking about? You understand inverse functions a little bit? The x and y's are just flip-flopped. Okay? So how do you find an inverse function? Okay? Well, I just talked about how the x and the y's, they basically just switch, right? So, if the directions would tell you to find f inverse of x, that's what this f to the negative 1 power of x means. It just means find the inverse of f. Okay? Find the inverse of f. When you see that notation, it's telling you to find the inverse. All you have to do to find the inverse of a function, switch the x and the y wherever they're at, and then get y by itself. So the original function said y equals 3x squared plus 1, right? Well, I'm just going to switch the x and the y around. X equals 3y squared plus 1. Because that's what an inverse function is going to do. It's going to take and undo one, or one becomes the other, basically. Okay? Because we want the x to become the y and the y to become the x. They're going to undo one another. So I switch them around, and now I'm just going to get y by itself. How do I get y by itself? what would I do here? I have x equals 3y squared plus 1. I'm getting y by itself. I'd minus 1. I'd rather do that than divide right away. I'd just minus the 1. So then I have x minus 1 equals 3y squared. Then I divide by 3. So that gives me x minus 1 divided by 3 equals y squared. Y is not by itself yet because it says y squared. What would you have to do to get rid of the squared? Square root both sides. So that's where the square root comes in. Okay, I square root both sides to get y by itself. And because I'm square rooting both sides of an equal sign, I'd like you guys just to get in the habit of writing that plus or minus there. Okay? Just like when you were solving quadratic equations and you used square roots, you had to put plus or minus there. So y equals plus or minus the square root of x minus 1 all over 3. Okay? And then the last step is just using the correct notation. The directions did say find f inverse of x. So instead of writing y equals, let's write f inverse of x equals plus or minus the square root of x minus 1 all over 3. This is the inverse function of this. They would undo one another. Check it. Plug in your 13. See if you get your 2 that we're supposed to get. Plug in a 13 right here. 13 minus 1, 12 divided by 3, 4, square root of 4, 2. It worked. Okay, if you want to try the 4 and see if you get 1, you can do that as well. Okay, but these two functions undo one another. So if you plug in a 2, out comes a 13. So therefore, if you plug in a 13 in this one, out comes a 2. You get back to where you started. To sum it up, how do you find inverse functions then? What's your first step? Switch the x and the y around. So that's your first step. Whenever you're finding inverse functions, you switch the x and the y around, and then you just got to get y by itself. So switch the x and the y around, then get y by itself. That's what I'd write down if I was taking notes. Okay? To find an inverse function, I switch the x and the y around and get y by itself. And then just write your answer using correct notation, please. Okay? And what could you do to double check and you make sure you did it right? Just plug in some numbers, right? Pick some easy numbers, plug them in.
Switch x and y to what?
And then get y by itself. Switch the x and the y, and then get y by itself. Or solve for y, however you want to write it. Like. But that's how you will always be able to just find inverse functions. So better on that? I think that was all those problems 34 to 39. That's all you do in those problems. You just find the inverse. Okay? That's on page 1015 that you were assigned. Also on those problems on page 1015, if you're looking at it, like look at 37. Do you see where it says x is less than or equal to 0? You don't really need to worry about that. Just worry about the function itself. Okay? So all those problems are exactly the same. First step, switch x and y around. Then get y by itself. Alright? So, inverse. Good with inverse? Okay, what's my time on my video?
9 minutes.
9. Go ahead and pause it.